A white police officer laughed when he saw a black woman step out of a brand new Rolls-Royce in front of the courthouse. "Lady," he said, "stolen luxury cars do not belong to people like you." He ignored her calm voice. He ignored the registration in her hand. He ignored every warning from the bystanders who had already started to gather on the sidewalk. Instead, he handcuffed her beside the most watched courthouse in the entire state. The crowd began filming within seconds, phones rising one after another, like a wave moving through the square. Then the woman made exactly one phone call. Less than 15 minutes later, police commanders, federal investigators, and the Chief Justice arrived together, moving in formation toward the very spot where she stood. By sunset, the officer had not just lost the arrest. He had lost his badge, his career, and everything he had once believed made him untouchable. The morning had begun like any other morning in that city, quiet in the way that cities are quiet right before something enormous happens. The courthouse downtown was preparing for one of the largest trials the region had seen in nearly a decade, and reporters from 3 different networks had already claimed their positions along the marble steps. Cameras on tripods lined the plaza like soldiers waiting for an order. Inside the building, clerks moved through hallways with stacks of files, and security officers checked badges twice instead of once, aware that today carried a different kind of weight. Outside, traffic crawled past the barricades as onlookers slowed their cars just to see the gathering crowd. Somewhere beneath the noise of engines and footsteps, a deep, smooth engine sound rolled into the plaza, almost gliding rather than driving. A black Rolls-Royce Phantom eased to a stop directly in front of the courthouse entrance, its paint catching the early light in a way that made several heads turn at once. For a moment, the plaza seemed to hold its breath, uncertain whether a celebrity or a politician had arrived. The driver's side door opened first, but it was the passenger door that drew every eye, because the woman who stepped out moved with the unhurried calm of someone who had never once needed to explain herself. She wore a charcoal suit, simple and tailored, with no logos, no flash, nothing that screamed for attention. Her name was Naomi Carter, a federal judge in her late 40s, known across the legal community for 2 qualities above all others: an unshakable sense of fairness and a silence that unsettled people far more than shouting ever could. Very few people outside her closest circle knew that the car belonged entirely to her, purchased with savings built over 20 years of discipline, not gifted, not borrowed, not stolen. She had grown up in a small house with a single bedroom shared among 3 sisters, and she had built every single thing in her life one decision at a time. None of that history was visible to the man who watched her from across the plaza, a patrol officer named Daniel Brooks, who saw only a woman, a luxury car, and a set of assumptions that had already formed inside his mind before she had taken 3 steps. Brooks had been on the force for 11 years, respected by some colleagues, quietly avoided by others who had learned to keep their distance from his temper. He leaned against his patrol car, arms crossed, watching Naomi walk toward the courthouse steps with an expression that slowly shifted from curiosity to something colder. "No way that is her car," he muttered to the officer standing beside him, loud enough for 2 bystanders nearby to hear every word. His partner, a younger officer named Marcus Lee, glanced at the vehicle and then back at Brooks, unsure why the comment carried so much certainty. In Brooks's mind, an equation had already solved itself without evidence, without registration, without a single fact beyond what his eyes had decided to believe. A woman, he thought, black, driving a car worth more than most people earn in 5 years. To him, the math did not need checking, because the conclusion had arrived before the question had even been asked. He pushed off from his cruiser and began walking toward her with the deliberate stride of someone who believed he was about to uncover something important. A few feet away, a group of attorneys waiting for the morning session noticed the officer's posture change, and one of them, a younger woman holding a leather folder, slowed her pace just enough to watch. Something about the way Brooks approached, chest forward, jaw tight, told her this was not a routine check. The plaza, already crowded with reporters and clerks and curious onlookers, seemed to shift its attention all at once toward the black car and the woman standing calmly beside it. Nobody in that crowd yet understood who she was, but everybody could sense, almost instinctively, that something uncomfortable was about to unfold in plain daylight. Brooks reached her within seconds, positioning himself just close enough to assert authority without technically crossing into hostility, a tactic he had used countless times before. "Ma'am," he said, "I need to see your license, your registration, and proof of insurance right now." Naomi did not flinch, did not raise her voice, did not even shift her expression beyond a calm, practiced patience that came from decades spent inside courtrooms, far harsher than any sidewalk confrontation. She reached into her bag with slow, deliberate movements, fully aware that sudden motion could be misread, and handed him exactly what he asked for without a single word of protest. Brooks studied the documents the way a man studies something he has already decided is fake, flipping the registration card over twice, holding the license up to the light as though searching for a flaw that did not exist. "People fake papers every day," he said flatly, more to the gathering crowd than to her. Naomi's expression remained unreadable, though something behind her eyes suggested she had seen this exact pattern play out before, in different rooms, with different uniforms, but always with the same underlying assumption. She said only, "The documents are accurate, officer," and waited. Marcus Lee, standing a few steps behind his partner, leaned in and lowered his voice. "It looks legitimate, Brooks," he said carefully, trying to diffuse the tension before it grew teeth. Brooks ignored him entirely, his attention narrowing instead on proving a theory that had nothing to do with facts and everything to do with the story he had already built inside his head. He needed her to be guilty of something, anything, because the alternative meant admitting his first instinct had been wrong, and men like Brooks rarely allowed themselves that kind of admission in public. The small crowd nearby had grown thicker, drawn by the universal human curiosity that gathers wherever conflict seems to be brewing. A retired teacher walking her dog paused at the edge of the plaza, phone already lifting halfway from her pocket. Two court clerks on a smoke break exchanged a glance that needed no translation, the kind of look people share when they recognize a familiar injustice taking shape in front of them. Even the reporters who had arrived for an entirely different story began glancing sideways, sensing that something far more immediate might be unfolding right there on the steps. Naomi remained still, her composure unshaken despite the rising tension around her, because she understood something Brooks did not yet grasp, that patience often outlasts power. She had built an entire career on the principle that calm authority speaks louder than panic ever could, and she intended to let that principle carry her through whatever came next. Brooks, however, seemed to mistake her stillness for weakness, doubling down with each passing second, as though raising his voice might somehow manufacture the guilt he was determined to find. "You understand I can have this car impounded right now," he said, his tone sharpening, daring her to react. Naomi met his eyes directly for the first time since the confrontation began, her voice low and even. "You're welcome to call it in," she said, "but I'd advise you to verify everything first." The certainty in those 4 words landed harder than any protest could have, because it was the calm of someone who already knew, with complete confidence, exactly how this would end. By now, the gathering crowd had stopped pretending to mind their own business, drifting closer in small clusters along the courthouse steps. Brooks ordered Naomi to step away from the vehicle entirely, his voice carrying across the plaza, with a sharpness that turned even more heads. She complied without resistance, moving exactly as instructed, her hands visible, her posture relaxed in a way that seemed almost designed to highlight just how unnecessary his aggression truly was. Among the onlookers, a tall man in a gray suit suddenly stiffened, recognition flashing across his face the moment he got a clear look at her. He was an attorney who had appeared before Naomi's courtroom on more than one occasion, and the sight of her standing in handcuff range stunned him into a brief, frozen silence. He leaned toward the colleague beside him and whispered just loud enough to be heard by 2 or 3 nearby strangers. "That is Judge Carter," he said, his voice tight with disbelief. The words rippled outward in a slow wave, passed from one mouth to another until a noticeable shift moved through the crowd, an unmistakable tension that came from realizing exactly how wrong this entire scene had become. Brooks either did not hear the warning or chose to dismiss it entirely, too committed to his version of events to allow new information to interrupt it. "I do not care who she says she is," he snapped, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear with painful clarity. The statement landed like a small explosion across the plaza, because Naomi had said nothing about her title, had not once raised her position as a shield, and yet Brooks had already decided that any claim to credibility from her had to be a lie. More phones rose into the air. A young man recording from the courthouse steps adjusted his angle to capture both Brooks and Naomi in the same frame, narrating quietly under his breath for an audience he had not yet gathered, but somehow already sensed would exist. A live stream blinked into existence on a small screen held by a college student near the barricades, the little red icon glowing as though marking the exact second history decided to take notice. Within minutes, dozens of strangers were no longer just watching, they were broadcasting, turning a quiet sidewalk encounter into something the city would not be able to ignore by evening. The pressure in the air thickened with every passing second. Not loud, not violent, but heavy in the way silence becomes heavy, right before a storm breaks. Naomi remained motionless, watching Brooks with an expression that held no fear, only a kind of patient disappointment, the look of someone who has seen this story before and already knows exactly how foolish the ending will appear once the truth comes out. Brooks, sensing the crowd's mood shifting against him, seemed to grow even more determined to assert control, mistaking the rising tension as a reason to escalate rather than a warning to stop. Somewhere near the edge of the plaza, a court security officer radioed in a brief, cautious message, alerting his supervisor that something unusual was unfolding outside, though he chose his words carefully, unsure yet of how serious the situation truly was. Inside the courthouse, clerks glanced toward the windows, drawn by the commotion building outside the very walls where order was supposed to be sacred. The contradiction was not lost on anyone watching closely. A system built to deliver justice fairly was now standing witness to the opposite happening right outside its own front doors. Brooks reached for his handcuffs, the metallic click of the restraint mechanism cutting through the noise of the crowd like a small, sharp warning. The plaza seemed to freeze entirely in that instant, voices dropping into stunned silence, as though everyone present understood, almost simultaneously, that a line had just been crossed that could not be uncrossed. A nearby attorney stepped forward, instinctively, raising a hand in protest. "Officer, this is unnecessary," she said firmly, her voice carrying clear authority despite the chaos surrounding her. Brooks turned toward her sharply. "Back up, ma'am, or you'll be detained too," he warned, his voice carrying the kind of threat that had clearly worked on others before today. The attorney hesitated, torn between her instinct to intervene and the very real fear of becoming another headline herself. Naomi, sensing the tension rippling outward, spoke calmly, her voice steady enough to cut through the noise without ever rising in volume. "It's all right," she said simply. "Let him finish what he started." The cuffs closed around her wrists with a soft metallic snap that somehow sounded louder than anything else happening in that crowded plaza. Naomi did not resist, did not pull away, did not offer the slightest gesture of struggle, because she understood, perhaps better than anyone present, that her composure in this moment would matter far more than any argument she could make. "You'll regret making assumptions," she said quietly, not as a threat, but as a simple statement of fact, delivered with the same calm certainty she might have used, announcing a verdict. Brooks laughed, a short, dismissive sound, meant to project confidence he no longer fully possessed. "I'm just doing my job," he said, glancing toward the gathered onlookers as though seeking approval that was clearly not coming. Instead, the crowd's energy had shifted entirely, no longer curious bystanders, but something closer to witnesses. Eyes hardened, expressions tightening with a quiet, collective outrage that had been building steadily since the first accusation. Several people shook their heads. One woman muttered something under her breath about disgrace. Another simply lowered her phone for a moment, as if she could not bear to keep filming, only to raise it again seconds later, determined that this moment needed to be documented no matter how uncomfortable it felt. Word moved through the crowd like electricity now. The name Judge Carter passed from person to person with increasing urgency, each repetition adding weight to the realization that this was not simply an officer doing his duty, but something far more troubling unfolding in full public view. A reporter who had arrived that morning to cover an entirely unrelated trial suddenly found herself holding a story far larger than anything on her original assignment sheet. She began typing rapidly into her phone, capturing details before they slipped from memory, aware that whatever was happening here would not stay contained to this small courthouse plaza for long. The footage spreading online captured every second with brutal clarity. The calm woman in handcuffs, the officer standing over her with visible satisfaction, the documents he had dismissed, without proper review lying forgotten in his own hand. Viewers far beyond the plaza were beginning to watch in real time, drawn by the unmistakable tension visible even through a small phone screen. Somewhere across the city, in offices far removed from that courthouse steps, certain phones had already begun to buzz with urgent, unexpected messages. With her wrists restrained and her composure entirely intact, Naomi turned her head slightly toward Brooks and asked quietly but firmly for permission to make a single phone call. Brooks, perhaps sensing an opportunity to look reasonable in front of the growing crowd, allowed it, gesturing for another officer to hold the phone steady against her ear, since her hands remained cuffed behind her. The plaza grew quieter, almost unnaturally so, as if everyone present understood instinctively that whatever happened in the next few seconds would matter far more than anything that had come before. "This is Judge Carter," she said, her voice steady, measured, utterly without panic. "I need immediate assistance." A brief pause followed, the kind of silence that stretches longer than its actual length because of the weight pressing down on it. From the other end of the line, a voice replied simply, "I understand. Nothing more." No explanation, no raised tone, no lengthy instructions, just two words delivered with the calm certainty of someone who already knew exactly what needed to happen next. The call ended almost as quickly as it began, lasting less than 20 seconds total, a detail that would later strike observers as remarkable given everything that followed. Brooks, watching the brief exchange with visible amusement, could not resist a small laugh. "That's your big move," he said, shaking his head as though confirming his own theory that her composure had been nothing more than empty bluffing all along. Several officers nearby exchanged uncertain glances, sensing something in Naomi's expression that did not match the mockery being directed at her. She did not respond to his comment, did not defend herself, did not explain who she had called or why. Instead, she simply waited, her posture unchanged, her breathing calm, an expression of quiet, unwavering patience settled across her face like someone watching dominoes she had already arranged begin their inevitable fall. The crowd, sensing something building beneath the surface, grew increasingly restless. Phones still raised, voices hushed, attention locked entirely on the courthouse steps, where the next chapter of this story seemed about to begin. Marcus Lee, the younger officer who had tried earlier to caution his partner, shifted uncomfortably beside his cruiser, glancing repeatedly toward the street as though anticipating something neither he nor Brooks could yet fully see coming. A court security guard, standing near the entrance, lowered his radio slightly, listening intently to a transmission that had suddenly grown more urgent in tone. Whatever message had traveled through that brief, quiet phone call, it was already moving through channels far beyond what anyone standing in that plaza could observe directly. Far across the city, inside offices connected by secure lines and rapid communication networks, a chain of urgent calls had begun the moment Naomi's voice reached the right ears. Names were exchanged, instructions issued, vehicles dispatched within minutes of that brief conversation ending. The wheels of an entire system, often slow and bureaucratic under ordinary circumstances, had suddenly found a reason to move with extraordinary speed, propelled by a quiet certainty among those receiving the call that delay was simply not an option this time. In one office, overlooking the river, a deputy chief set down his coffee mid-sip the moment the name on his screen registered, abandoning the meeting he had been chairing without a single word of explanation. In another building entirely, a federal marshal was already reaching for his car keys before his supervisor had finished the sentence. The kind of instinctive urgency reserved for situations that allow no margin for hesitation. Calls layered upon calls, each one shorter than the last, until the entire apparatus of accountability, that normally moved through paperwork and procedure, instead moved through instinct, recognition, and a shared, unspoken understanding of exactly how serious this had already become. 15 minutes after that brief phone call ended, the plaza outside the courthouse transformed entirely. The quiet tension of moments earlier shattered by a convoy of vehicles arriving in rapid, coordinated succession. Black sedans pulled up alongside marked patrol cars, doors opening almost simultaneously as figures in suits and uniforms stepped out with the kind of urgency that immediately silenced the murmuring crowd. Among them were senior officials from the police department, representatives from internal affairs, an attorney from the state prosecutor's office, members of court security leadership, and federal marshals, whose presence alone signaled that this situation had escalated far beyond anything routine. Brooks watched the arrival with a slowly dawning sense of unease, his earlier confidence beginning to crack as he registered just how many high-ranking individuals had suddenly converged on a single sidewalk arrest. He glanced toward Marcus, searching for some reassurance, but his partner's expression offered none. Eyes wide, posture stiff, clearly recognizing the same warning signs Brooks himself was only beginning to process. The crowd parted instinctively as the police chief stepped forward, his pace deliberate, his expression unreadable, moving directly past Brooks without so much as a glance in his direction. "Your Honor," the chief said, his voice carrying clearly across the now silent plaza as he addressed Naomi directly. "Are you all right?" The two words, "Your Honor," struck the crowd like a physical force, confirming in an instant everything the whispers had already suggested. Brooks felt the blood drain from his face, the full weight of the title landing with the precision of a verdict already decided. For the first time since the encounter began, doubt crept into his expression, replacing the earlier certainty with something closer to dawning horror. Naomi answered calmly, despite the handcuffs still binding her wrists, her composure unwavering even now. "I'm fine," she said simply, "though I would appreciate these being removed." The chief turned immediately, his voice sharp with command, as he ordered another officer to release her at once, the sound of the cuffs, unlocking, echoing through the plaza, like a small, symbolic undoing of everything Brooks had set into motion less than half an hour earlier. The crowd, watching in stunned silence, seemed collectively to exhale, releasing tension that had built steadily since the first accusation was hurled. Brooks attempted to speak, stumbling over a half-formed explanation about following procedure, about reasonable suspicion, about simply doing his job as he understood it. No one acknowledged him. The internal affairs representative did not look in his direction. The federal marshals exchanged brief, clipped words with court security, already coordinating next steps that clearly did not include hearing Brooks's side of the story just yet. It was, perhaps, the loneliest moment of his entire career, standing surrounded by colleagues and superiors who had all, in the span of a few seconds, decided he no longer mattered to the conversation taking place. Naomi rubbed her wrists gently once freed, glancing briefly at the gathered officials before turning her attention to the crowd that had witnessed everything from beginning to end. There was no triumph in her expression, no satisfaction at watching Brooks unravel in real time, only the same steady calm that had carried her through the entire ordeal. Whatever came next, she seemed to understand, would not require her to raise her voice even once, because the truth, properly examined, rarely needed defending by the person it had already vindicated. Within the hour, investigators had gathered every piece of available footage, treating the courthouse plaza as something closer to a crime scene than a simple traffic stop gone wrong. Body cam recordings were pulled directly from Brooks's uniform and from Marcus Lee's as well, synced carefully against timestamps to construct a complete, unbroken record of the encounter. Street cameras positioned along the courthouse perimeter offered additional angles, capturing details the officer's own equipment had missed, including the exact moment Brooks dismissed the registration without ever truly examining it. Court security footage added yet another layer, showing the crowd's reaction building steadily from curiosity into open concern well before the handcuffs ever appeared. Investigators cross-referenced this material against the dozens of live streams and recordings already circulating among bystanders, each version telling essentially the same story from a slightly different vantage point. Brooks mocking, suspicious without cause, dismissive of documentation, escalating a routine stop into something far more serious, based entirely on assumptions formed before a single word had been exchanged. An attorney representing the city arrived within the hour as well, standing quietly to one side as internal affairs began their preliminary review, fully aware that whatever legal exposure existed here would only grow larger the longer the footage circulated unanswered. Investigators sat Brooks down in a small administrative office inside the courthouse. The contrast between that quiet, sterile room and the chaos of the plaza outside, almost unbearable in its silence. "Why didn't you verify the vehicle identification number before escalating this stop?" one investigator asked directly, her tone neither hostile nor sympathetic, simply factual. Brooks struggled to answer, offering fragments of justification that crumbled the moment they left his mouth. He mentioned instinct. He mentioned experience. He mentioned a pattern he claimed to have noticed over years on patrol, though, when pressed for specific examples, his explanations grew increasingly vague and increasingly difficult to defend. The investigator made careful notes, her expression giving nothing away, though everyone in that room understood exactly how thin his reasoning sounded, once stripped of the confidence that had carried him through the original confrontation. Outside the courthouse, the footage had already spread far beyond the initial crowd of bystanders, shared and reshared, until it reached corners of the city that had no direct connection to the plaza at all. Strangers who had never met Naomi Carter found themselves discussing her composure, her patience, the simple dignity with which she had endured something no one should ever have to endure. Equally, strangers who had never met Daniel Brooks found themselves dissecting his every word, his posture, his dismissive laughter, building a portrait of someone whose actions seemed to confirm exactly the kind of bias many had long suspected operated quietly beneath the surface of supposedly routine policing. By early afternoon, the story had taken on a momentum no single person could control or contain, moving through the city with the kind of speed that made traditional investigations feel almost quaint by comparison. The footage was undeniable, consistent across every angle, leaving no room for the kind of conflicting accounts that so often allowed similar incidents to fade quietly without consequence. For Brooks, sitting alone in that small administrative office while his career hung in increasingly fragile balance, the absence of any defense beyond his own word had never felt more dangerous. As the investigation deepened throughout the afternoon, internal affairs began pulling Brooks's complete personnel file, a thick stack of documents that told a story far older than the events of that single morning. Buried within years of routine evaluations and commendations were several complaints that had been filed over the preceding decade, each one involving accusations of excessive authority during traffic stops, the majority directed at drivers of expensive vehicles who happened to be people of color. None of these complaints had ever resulted in serious consequences, each one quietly closed, dismissed, or settled without any lasting mark on his record. A pattern emerged with uncomfortable clarity once investigators laid the complaints side by side, dates spanning multiple years, locations scattered across different parts of the city, yet the underlying behavior strikingly consistent each time. A businessman driving a luxury sedan stopped without clear cause. A young executive detained over a registration that later proved entirely legitimate. A retired physician questioned aggressively, despite producing every requested document within the first minute of the encounter. Each case, examined individually, had seemed minor enough to overlook. Together, they painted a picture that no one within the department could continue pretending not to see. Previously, these complaints had lacked the kind of undeniable evidence necessary to force real accountability, often reduced to conflicting accounts between officer and civilian with no clear way to determine the truth. This time, circumstances had aligned differently. Cameras everywhere. Witnesses by the dozens. A victim whose position and credibility made dismissal nearly impossible. The very visibility that Brooks had perhaps assumed worked in his favor, given his badge and his authority. had instead become the mechanism through which his pattern of behavior was finally, undeniably exposed to full scrutiny. Investigators interviewed Marcus Lee separately, hoping to understand whether he had witnessed similar behavior from his partner in the past. Reluctantly, Marcus admitted that he had noticed something uncomfortable building over the months they had worked together. Small comments, certain assumptions Brooks seemed to make almost automatically whenever certain types of vehicles or certain types of people crossed his attention. "I should have said something sooner," Marcus admitted quietly, his voice heavy with the kind of regret that comes from recognizing complicity only after the consequences had already become impossible to ignore. The city's legal department, meanwhile, began preparing for what now seemed an inevitable wave of public and possibly legal scrutiny, aware that the footage alone created significant liability, regardless of how the internal investigation eventually concluded. Conversations shifted quickly from whether Brooks had acted improperly to how extensively the department itself had failed by allowing years of similar complaints to accumulate without meaningful intervention. For many watching the unfolding story from outside, this realization landed even harder than the original incident, the understanding that what had happened to Naomi Carter was not an isolated failure, but the visible surface of something far deeper and far more troubling. By evening, as the sheer volume of evidence against Brooks continued mounting, even his most sympathetic colleagues within the department found themselves struggling to offer any meaningful defense. The story no longer belonged solely to that single morning outside the courthouse. It belonged now to every overlooked complaint, every dismissed pattern, every moment when someone in a position to intervene had chosen silence instead of accountability. For those watching closely, the satisfaction of finally seeing consequences arrive felt tempered by the uncomfortable awareness of just how long those consequences had been delayed. A retired captain who had once supervised Brooks early in his career was contacted that evening for a brief statement, and his response, though guarded, carried its own quiet weight. "He was a good officer on paper," the captain said, "but paper never tells you what someone assumes the moment they see a certain face behind a certain wheel." The comment circulated quickly among investigators, less because it offered new evidence, and more because it captured, almost perfectly, the exact failure the department now found itself forced to confront. Years of looking only at the paper, never at the pattern underneath it, had allowed exactly this outcome to remain possible for far too long. Throughout the entire ordeal, Naomi Carter conducted herself with a restraint that surprised even those who knew her well, declining every opportunity to transform her experience into something louder or more vindictive than it needed to be. When reporters approached later that afternoon, eager for a statement dripping with outrage or condemnation, she offered instead a measured response, delivered with the same calm she had maintained throughout the entire encounter. "I trust the process to reveal what happened accurately," she said simply, declining to elaborate further despite repeated questions pressing for something sharper. An aide from the prosecutor's office asked her directly whether she intended to pursue personal legal action against Brooks, a question that carried an implicit assumption that anger, however justified, would naturally seek the harshest possible outlet. Naomi considered the question briefly before answering. "No one is above the law," she said, "and that includes officers, but my interest here is not personal retribution." The aide seemed almost confused by the response, accustomed perhaps to victims whose understandable fury demanded immediate, visible punishment rather than careful, systemic correction. Instead, Naomi requested 3 specific things from the department, delivered not as ultimatums, but as measured recommendations grounded in years of judicial experience. She asked for a thorough, independent investigation into every prior complaint filed against Brooks, ensuring that patterns long ignored would finally receive proper scrutiny. She asked for meaningful reform to officer training protocols, particularly around bias recognition and de-escalation, recognizing that punishing one individual without addressing underlying systemic gaps would accomplish little in the long run. Finally, she asked for transparent public reporting of the investigation's conclusions, insisting that accountability meant nothing without visibility. Her requests circulated quickly among officials and observers alike, drawing comparisons to previous high-profile incidents where victims, often justifiably, sought primarily personal vindication rather than structural change. The contrast struck many as remarkable, not because anger would have been undeserved, but because restraint of this caliber, paired with such clear, constructive demands, revealed something about character that no title or position could manufacture on its own. Colleagues who had worked alongside Naomi for years were unsurprised by her response, recognizing in it the same disciplined judgment that had defined her approach to every case she had ever presided over. Members of the public, watching the story develop across screens throughout the city, began to notice the distinction emerging between two very different kinds of power on display that day. Brooks had wielded the obvious kind, a badge, a uniform, the authority to detain and restrain, all of it deployed carelessly and without justification. Naomi had demonstrated something far quieter, the ability to remain composed under direct provocation, to resist the pull toward retaliation, and to channel a deeply personal injustice into a call for broader, lasting correction, rather than narrow, momentary satisfaction. That distinction, more than any single detail of the original confrontation, seemed to capture the public's imagination as the day wore on. Strangers debating the story across the city found themselves returning repeatedly to the same observation, that real authority rarely needed to announce itself loudly, while genuine integrity often revealed itself most clearly in moments when shouting would have been so easy and so understandable. For many, watching Naomi Carter refuse the easier path of pure outrage taught a lesson that lingered far longer than the initial shock of seeing her handcuffed outside the very courthouse she served. A local news anchor, closing out the evening broadcast that night, summarized the day with a single line that many viewers would repeat to one another in the days that followed. "What we witnessed today was not just one officer's mistake," she said, "but a demonstration of what it looks like when someone refuses to let injustice make them smaller." Across dinner tables and office break rooms throughout the city, the same conversation repeated itself in slightly different words, people weighing what they would have done in Naomi's place, and most quietly admitting they doubted they could have matched her composure under circumstances so plainly unfair. 3 weeks later, the disciplinary hearing convened inside a conference room far smaller and far quieter than the chaotic plaza where everything had originally unfolded. Brooks sat at a long table across from a panel of senior officials, his uniform pressed, his posture rigid, though the confidence that had once defined him on patrol had long since drained away under the weight of accumulated evidence. His attorney sat beside him, flipping through pages of footage transcripts and witness statements that offered increasingly little room for any meaningful defense. The panel reviewed every detail methodically, beginning with the original traffic stop and moving steadily through each subsequent decision Brooks had made that morning. They examined his failure to properly verify the vehicle's registration before escalating the encounter. They reviewed his decision to apply handcuffs despite full cooperation and clear, valid documentation. They considered his dismissive treatment of warnings from bystanders who had recognized Naomi Carter well before the situation reached its most damaging point. Each decision, examined individually, might have seemed survivable. Together, they formed an undeniable portrait of conduct that fell far short of what the badge demanded. Beyond the events of that single morning, the panel also addressed the broader pattern uncovered during the subsequent investigation, the years of similar complaints that had previously gone unanswered. A representative from Internal Affairs presented findings showing that at least 4 prior incidents bore striking similarities to what had occurred outside the courthouse, each one involving assumptions made about drivers based on little more than the vehicle they happened to be operating. The cumulative weight of this pattern made clear that the morning's events were not an isolated lapse in judgment, but the latest expression of behavior that should have been addressed long before it ever reached this point. When asked directly to explain his actions, Brooks offered what amounted to a final, halting attempt at justification, citing years of experience and instinct that he claimed had usually served him well. The panel listened without visible reaction, though the silence that followed his statement carried its own clear verdict long before any official decision had been announced. One panel member finally spoke, her voice steady and without malice. Instinct that consistently targets one demographic isn't instinct, she said. It's bias, and bias has no place behind a badge. The findings, when finally delivered, left little room for interpretation. Brooks was found responsible for racial profiling, abuse of authority, unlawful detention, and conduct unbecoming an officer, four separate violations that together left the panel with no reasonable alternative beyond the most serious consequence available. He was terminated from the department immediately, his certification revoked in a decision that would prevent him from working as a sworn officer anywhere within the state. The badge he had worn for 11 years was removed and placed gently on the table in front of him, a small, quiet gesture that nonetheless carried the full weight of everything that had been lost. Brooks sat motionless for a long moment, staring at the badge resting on the polished wood surface. The symbol that had once granted him authority over countless ordinary mornings, now reduced to nothing more than a piece of metal stripped of meaning. He did not protest the decision. He did not argue. He simply nodded once, gathered the few papers in front of him, and walked out of that small conference room into a future entirely different from the one he had imagined when he first put on that uniform 11 years earlier. Outside the courthouse that same afternoon, Naomi Carter walked down the marble steps exactly as she had walked up them weeks earlier, calm, unhurried, entirely unconcerned with the small cluster of reporters waiting near the bottom for some final comment. She offered them a brief nod and a few measured words about her continued confidence in the judicial process, declining once again to indulge in anything resembling triumph or vindication. There was no raised fist, no dramatic statement, no lingering glance back toward the building where her own ordeal had so publicly unfolded weeks before. She walked instead toward the same black Rolls-Royce that had started everything that morning. The vehicle parked exactly where it had been left, untouched, unclaimed, exactly as legitimate as it had always been. A young valet, recognizing her immediately, hurried to open the door, though Naomi waved him off gently, preferring to open it herself as she always had. She settled into the driver's seat, adjusted the mirror with the same unbothered calm she had maintained throughout the entire ordeal, and pulled slowly away from the curb, without a single backward glance toward the courthouse steps. The crowd that had gathered weeks earlier to witness her humiliation had long since dispersed, replaced now by a much smaller group who understood the full story and simply wanted to see, with their own eyes, that justice had indeed found its way to a fair conclusion. Among them stood the attorney who had first recognized her that morning, watching the car disappear down the street with quiet satisfaction. Beside him stood Marcus Lee, no longer in uniform that day. Having requested personal leave following the disciplinary hearing, his expression a complicated mixture of relief and lingering discomfort over everything he had witnessed and failed to prevent. For the city, the story did not end neatly with Brooks's termination, but rather opened into a longer, more deliberate process of reform that Naomi herself had specifically requested weeks earlier. The department announced sweeping changes to its training protocols within the month, incorporating mandatory bias recognition courses and stricter accountability measures for handling civilian complaints. An independent oversight committee was established to review patterns of officer conduct that might otherwise have continued slipping through bureaucratic cracks the way Brooks's prior complaints once had. None of it erased what had happened, but all of it represented exactly the kind of lasting correction Naomi had asked for, instead of simple, narrow punishment. In the months that followed, Naomi returned to her courtroom much as she always had, presiding over cases with the same steady discipline that had defined her career long before that single morning outside the courthouse. She rarely spoke publicly about the incident again, declining most interview requests, choosing instead to let her continued work speak for itself in the way she always preferred. Those who knew her well understood this was entirely consistent with who she had always been, someone who measured worth not in attention received, but in quiet, consistent integrity, maintained through every circumstance, easy or difficult alike. A badge grants authority, but it cannot manufacture character, and the difference between the two had never been clearer than it was on that single, unforgettable morning outside the courthouse. Brooks had possessed every formal symbol of power available to him: a uniform, a weapon, the legal ability to detain, Yet none of it had been enough to withstand the simple, undeniable truth once it finally came to light. Naomi had possessed none of those formal symbols in that moment, only her composure, her patience, and an unwavering belief that the truth, properly revealed, would always outlast any false certainty built on nothing more than careless assumption. Justice, in the end, belonged to neither rank nor race, but to those willing to uphold the truth, even when doing so required nothing louder than simply waiting, calmly and without fear, for the world to catch up to what had been true all along.